Have you ever experienced body shame? Well, there's a really good chance that the shame you feel about your body isn't your fault. It may actually be because of sexual objectification. My name's Julia, I'm getting my doctorate in clinical psychology, and I'm a huge advocate of embodied self-love, and I'm really fascinated about the things that get in the way of us loving our bodies. One of them being sexual objectification. What is sexual objectification? Well, I'm very glad you asked. Sexual objectification is the act of treating someone else like an object that is only valued for the use by another. What this might look like in practice is someone catcalling another person as they walk down the street, which totally disregards the person's subjective experience of being catcalled. Alternatively, this might look like being in a relationship with someone who only values you for your physical appearance. And another example of sexual objectification that's really common is media, where bodies, especially women's bodies, are treated just as objects or props in advertisements, rather than as whole people with subjective experiences. So sexual objectification is kind of the cultural water that we swim in. And unfortunately, because that's the water that we swim in, we learn to objectify ourselves so that we can survive in this environment. Essentially, we learn to self-objectify so that we can survive in a world that sexually objectifies us. In 1997, two feminist theorists created self-objectification theory, which essentially posits the experiential consequences for women of living in a sexually objectifying world. Now, sexual objectification does happen to both men and women and non-gendered folks as well. However, for the course of this video, I'll be focusing on women's experience specifically. So you can think of sexual objectification as the cultural water we swim in, and self-objectification as the learned internal coping mechanism that we have used to adapt to this sexually objectifying world. So in essence, self-objectification helps us prepare for and plan for the times that we will be viewed as objects. Being able to predict and plan for the times that we're going to be objectified is pretty important because women's looks, unfortunately, often dictate their success and safety in this world. So what does self-objectification involve? Essentially, it can be distilled down to the experience of viewing yourself from the outside. Fredrickson and Roberts, who are the two feminist theorists who founded self-objectification theory, call this internalizing the external observer. So essentially, we learn to look at our bodies, evaluate ourselves from the outside, rather than experiencing ourselves from the inside. This has 5 key consequences to women's lived experiences. The first is that we learn to constantly and vigilantly monitor our bodies to make sure that we are staying within the expectations of the external observer. We don't want to look too hot to attract unwanted attention, and we don't want to look too not hot to be outcasted and held back in our society. Women have to thread this very fine needle, which involves constantly monitoring our bodies to make sure that our hair's not out of place, to make sure that we are the right weight, to make sure that we're wearing the right things, to make sure that our lipstick hasn't smeared all over our face. This requires a lot of cognitive energy, and it makes us hypervigilant to our bodies. Secondly, self-objectification creates a substantial amount of anxiety. Having to monitor our bodies on a very regular basis creates a considerable amount of anxiety, which is the second experiential consequence of self-objectification. Women experience more body-based anxiety than men do. In a similar vein, women also experience more body shame than men because of self-objectification. Since our current beauty standards are very unrealistic and often require plastic surgery or a crazy amount of makeup to achieve, women are often falling short of the expectations of the external observer, which creates a considerable amount of body shame. The next consequence is that women are often interrupted in their flow states by thoughts and anxieties about their bodies. So you might have heard of flow states, which are essentially times where you're really present and in the moment. You're enjoying yourself, you're focusing on something that you love, that you're passionate about, or maybe you're engaging with your friends and feeling really authentic and present and having a lot of fun. But unfortunately, because we have to constantly monitor our bodies, and because we have more anxiety around our bodies, our flow states are interrupted by thoughts of, do I look all right? Is my hair in place? Is my makeup all over my face? So rather than being able to be focused and engaged in the flow state, we're interrupted by thoughts about how we look and how we're going to be perceived by others. Then finally, the fifth consequence of self-objectification is that women have impaired interoceptive awareness, which is the term that refers to your ability to make meaning of your inner senses and signals. So our body is sending us messages all the time. We're hungry, we need to go to the restroom, maybe the social experience isn't feeling right for us. All of these sensory experiences are things that we can make meaning of, and they help us navigate the world and take care of ourselves. However, women learn to turn off these signals because they are so disconnected from their bodies. You can imagine this happening, for instance, for a woman who is dieting to lose weight. If she is eating less food, then she might be feeling some rumbles in her stomach that she's hungry, but she can't pay attention to those signals because she can't eat anything. She's not letting herself eat anything, and over time, the connection between our body and our mind starts to wither and fade. So in essence, self-objectification causes women to disconnect from their bodies because they are no longer able to read or attune to their body's signals. Over time, the signal pathways between the body and the mind begin to wither and fade because they're no longer being paid attention to, which means that the connection between the body and mind essentially fades as well. So a quick recap. Sexual objectification is the external cultural water we swim in. Self-objectification is the internal learned coping strategy to survive in a world that sexually objectifies. Self-objectification causes women to view their bodies from the outside, which has 5 key consequences. It leads to chronic body monitoring, higher anxiety, increased body shame, interrupted flow states, and impaired interoceptive awareness. Sexual objectification not only has experiential consequences, but it also has cognitive consequences. It actually impacts how your brain functions. That's right, sexual objectification actually changes how your brain works. Specifically, when we learn to view ourselves from the outside, we're creating memories of our bodies from an allocentric perspective. The allocentric perspective you can think of as third-person perspective in a video game. In cognitive science, specifically spatial cognition, we think of storing memories in 2 different formats. The first is egocentric, where we're experiencing things from our body, from our own lived experience. And the second is an allocentric perspective that's more used when we're making mental maps of places. So specifically, when we objectify ourselves and we view ourselves from the outside, we start to build all of these memories of our bodies from the allocentric perspective, which are a little bit more judgmental, a little bit more critical, and definitely more cut off from our own lived experience of our bodies. Very importantly, the allocentric memories can't be updated by our egocentric experience. So we might be losing weight, we might be working out, but regardless of what we do, our self-image of perhaps being unfit or out of shape or overweight, all of those memories stored in our allocentric part of our brain won't actually be updated by us getting stronger, us lifting heavier weights, us wearing our clothes in a more confident way. If you want to hear a little bit more about the difference between the allocentric perspective and the egocentric perspective, I'll link my video on this that goes into detail down in the show notes below. But what's important to know is that sexual objectification causes us to view ourselves from the outside, which is stored in an allocentric memory and is impermeable to our lived experience and our egocentric perspective. I bring in the perspective of cognitive science here because I think it illuminates what we can do to combat self-objectification. The first piece is that we can build out more positive experiences of being in our body from an egocentric perspective. The second piece is that we can make more mental maps of our bodies in the allocentric perspective that hold more positive stories and narratives about our physical forms. The third piece is that we can transform our allocentric memories that are negative and maybe hold experiences of shame. We can transform those into an egocentric format where we can then work with them and integrate them. What that looks like in practice for me is using meditative touch to build a deeper relationship with my body using my own hands. Meditative touch helps us rewrite our negative narratives about our bodies by being present with our physical forms, signaling to them that they are safe and accepted, as well as listening deeply to our embodied wisdom. In a pilot study that I did on meditative touch, participants showed a statistically significant increase in body appreciation, decrease in dissociation, and an increase in interoceptive awareness. If you're interested in trying out meditative touch, I'll link a few videos in the show notes below. In conclusion, sexual objectification is the external context that we live in. Self-objectification is the internal learned coping mechanism that has considerable consequences for women's lived experiences. When we self-objectify, we internalize the external observer's perspective, which causes us to chronically monitor our bodies, have higher experiences of anxiety, feel increased body-based shame, have more interruptions of our flow states, and it also causes impairments to our interoceptive awareness. Additionally, sexual objectification can cause us to store negative self-images in our allocentric memory that aren't able to be updated by our lived experiences of our bodies. But not all hope is lost. If we create more memories from the egocentric perspective of enjoyment and acceptance and loving our bodies, we can counteract the negative self-image in the allocentric memory. If you've made it this far, I want to say a big thank you for joining me today as we explore sexual objectification and self-objectification. I'm so glad you're here. I want you to know that you're not alone. I'm with you on this journey of resisting sexual objectification and returning to being in deep relationship with our bodies. I'm glad you're here. Please stick around and let me know if any of this resonates with you down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on self-objectification, how it shows up for you, and if you found any good ways of resisting the forces of sexual objectification. Thanks and see you next time. Mwah!